In the middle of the 14th century, a killer arrived in Europe that would erase 1 in every 2 people alive. It came by sea. In 1347, trading ships arrived at a Sicilian port carrying silk. In the cargo lived rats, and in the fur of those rats lived fleas, and inside those fleas a bacterium waiting for a host. When the ships docked, most of the sailors aboard were already dead or dying. Horrified officials ordered them back out to sea. It was far too late. The people in these streets had no idea what a bacterium was. Disease, they believed, came from bad air, sin, or the alignment of the planets. Rats lived in every home, every ship, every granary. Nobody feared them. They were simply part of the world, the perfect delivery system. For the infected, it began quietly. A headache, a chill, and then a small, hard swelling in the neck. These swellings gave the plague its name, buboes. They grew to the size of an egg, sometimes an apple. Physicians came, and physicians died. They had no idea what they were fighting the seed, and every remedy they tried was useless. They drained blood. They burned herbs. They pressed dried toads to the swellings. They advised the patients. As the death toll rose, towns began sealing the sick inside their own homes. Whole families locked behind a painted cross, left to live or die together. Cities barred their gates. Travelers were turned away at spear point. But the plague did not travel on the roads alone. From Sicily, it spread with terrifying speed. Up through Italy, into France, monasteries tried to help the dying and were annihilated for it. In some, not a single monk survived to ring the bell. People prayed harder than ever, but the priests were dying too, and when prayer failed, faith itself began to crack. Some believed the plague was God's punishment. Bands of flagellants roamed from town to town, whipping themselves bloody to beg for mercy that never came. Others looked for someone to blame. Terrified communities accused outsiders, the poor and minorities, of poisoning the wells. Every evening, carts moved through the streets to a single, terrible call, a bell, and the words that emptied every house of its grief. At first, the dead were buried properly, one by one. But the dead came faster than graves could be dug. The churchyards filled within weeks. So the cities dug pits. Great trenches outside the walls, where the dead were laid in layers. The wealthy did the only thing that actually worked. They fled. They abandoned the cities for isolated country estates and locked the world out. In one Italian villa, a group of young nobles waited out the plague by telling each other stories. This is when the nightmarish plague doctor appeared, a beaked mask stuffed with flowers and herbs. The doctors believed the disease traveled in foul smells. In truth, the flea bites that spread it cared nothing for the flowers in that beak. Trade collapsed. Ships rotted at anchor. Fields of ripe grain stood uncut because there was no one left alive to harvest them. Whole villages simply vanished from the map, every soul dead or fled. Some of those empty fields never grew crops again. The chroniclers wrote of a grief the world had never known. Parents abandoned children. In 3 years, the plague killed perhaps 25 million people in Europe alone, between 1/3 and half of everyone who lived. To grasp that number, it would be as if, over 3 years, 1 in every 2 people you have ever known simply disappeared. One survivor wrote a line that still chills historians. He recorded the disaster so that the memory would outlive them. As mysteriously as it had come, it began to fade. By around 1351,
before the plague, workers were plentiful and cheap. Now they were rare, and for the first time in history, the poor could name their price.
peasants who had been bound to the land for life could now leave and demand wages elsewhere. Desperate lords had no choice but to pay. Panicked rulers passed laws to freeze wages and force people back to the fields. The laws failed. You cannot legislate away a shortage of human beings. Ordinary people began to eat better, dress better, and live better than any generation of peasants before them. The survivors, in a grim way, inherited the earth. With so few workers, machines and clever tools suddenly became worth the investment. Historians trace a line from the plague's labor shortage to centuries of invention. The plague had also shattered faith in old authorities. If the ancient physicians were so wrong about this, what else might they be wrong about?
Medicine began, slowly, to change, to observe, to question, to test.
Cities invented something new to protect themselves. Incoming ships had to wait in isolation before landing. For the first time, governments took organized responsibility for public health. It is a direct ancestor of every health authority on Earth today. The plague never fully left. It returned in waves for centuries' hate, but never again with that first apocalyptic force. Only in the modern era did we finally see the enemy, a single bacterium, carried by fleas, carried by rats. Its name is Yersinia pestis, and astonishingly, it still exists. A handful of people catch it every year. Modern archaeologists have found the great plague pits beneath our cities, the layered graves the chroniclers described. Beneath the foundations of many great cities lie those silent pits, millions of people, remembered now only as a layer in the earth. The beaked mask survives today as a symbol of dread, but behind it was only a frightened human being, doing their helpless best against the unknown. The voices of the survivors still speak from their pages, ordinary people describing the unimaginable, so that we would never forget it happened. Stand in one of these squares now, alive with people, and it is almost impossible to imagine it silent. Every door marked, every family gone. And yet the memorials are everywhere if you look. Quiet stones raised by survivors. The Black Death was the single deadliest event in recorded human history. Nothing before or since has killed such a share of humanity so quickly. Everything we now take for granted, quarantine, public health, the science of disease, was born from that catastrophe.
The disease that once emptied a continent in 3 years can now be cured with a course of pills costing almost nothing. On lonely islands, the ruins of the first quarantine stations still stand.
Look at the countryside from above, and the plague is still there. The ghost outlines of lost villages. Almost everyone alive in Europe today descends from the survivors of that plague, from the fraction who lived when half the world did not. The buildings that watched it happen are still standing. They saw the squares fill with the dead, 25 million people. Not a statistic, that many separate lives, each with a name the pits could not record and history could not keep. We remember the mask, the pits, the painted crosses. But the deepest legacy of the Black Death is quieter. The modern world of wages, science, and public health was not planned. It was, in part, built on the graves of the 14th century. Walk these old streets and you walk where it happened, Jew. Where the carts passed, where the crosses were painted, where the silence once was total. Life did what life always does. It returned, adapted, and grew again defos, out of the very ground that held the dead. The Black Death ended one world and, without meaning to, opened the door to ours. The survivors carried us here. Next time, the fire that a plague-weakened London could not stop sermons, and how one city burned its way into the modern age. Scribe, because to understand the world we live in, you have to know the one that had to end first.